On a February morning in 1943, 5 miles above the Tunisian sands, Lieutenant Harry C. Newessel bent over his navigation charts inside the cramped confines of a B-17 bomber. The oxygen mask fogged his view as he calculated their heading back from Tunis, marking coordinates with deliberate strokes of his pencil. His calculations told him what every man aboard wanted to hear. 17 minutes remained before they'd escape the effective range of enemy interceptors. 17 minutes to comparative safety over Allied territory. The tail gunner's voice shattered the routine over the intercom system, urgent and sharp, announcing fighters approaching from directly ahead at high altitude. Newessel barely registered the warning before an unforgettable sound reached his ears. Something he'd spend the rest of his days trying to adequately describe to those who hadn't been there. It wasn't the explosive crack of flak or the familiar percussion of machine gun rounds striking metal. Instead, he heard what could only be called a pronounced swoosh, immediately followed by a violent jar and a deep whoomp that resonated through the entire airframe. Looking up through the transparent nose of their Boeing B-17F, designated All-American 3, Newessel witnessed something that defied immediate comprehension. Fragments of a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 tumbled past their aircraft in a grotesque aerial disassembly. A wing section here, fuselage chunks there, even the canopy with its distinctive iron cross markings clearly visible as it spiraled downward toward the desert nearly 5 miles below. The enemy fighter hadn't been blown apart by gunfire in any conventional manner. Instead, it had physically struck their bomber, and yet somehow, impossibly, their aircraft remained airborne and under some measure of control. None of the 10 Americans aboard could grasp in that moment that they'd just entered one of aviation history's most thoroughly documented and analyzed incidents. Their flying fortress was maintaining flight with its tail assembly nearly completely severed, held to the main fuselage by nothing more than a handful of metal structural members and thin sheets of aluminum skin. Within the hour, a photograph would be captured of their damaged aircraft that would become among World War II's most iconic and studied images, pored over by aeronautical engineers and aviators for generations afterward. By every known principle of aerodynamic science, their survival made no sense whatsoever. The mathematical models and physical laws insisted they should already be tumbling earthward in pieces, scattered across the Saharan expanse below. Yet First Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg, Jr., son of Savannah society, maintained his iron grip on the control yoke with the same determination that had characterized his legendary 1938 season as a Duke University halfback playing for an undefeated team. He was somehow keeping 65,000 pounds of catastrophically damaged aluminum and steel in controlled flight. What was unfolding would evolve into aerial warfare's most improbable survival narrative, a demonstration of American manufacturing excellence paired with human willpower that would force German Luftwaffe intelligence officers to completely reassess their understanding of the B-17's capabilities. The pre-dawn darkness at Biskra airfield in Algeria had been pierced by the throaty roar of Wright Cyclone radial engines coming to life, their vibrations transmitted through sand that had worked its way into every crevice and corner of the desert base. February 1st had arrived with exceptional meteorological clarity. No sandstorms threatened operations, wind conditions remained minimal, visibility extended to the horizon. Perfect conditions for bombing operations, as the briefing officer had noted during the early morning mission briefing that had roused crews from their bunks at 4 in the morning. During his pre-flight inspection, First Lieutenant Bragg walked the perimeter of All-American 3 with the measured confidence of someone who had repeatedly proven himself under pressure. 25 years old, Bragg carried himself with understated assurance, born from success in multiple demanding arenas. Newspapers in his hometown still printed stories about his football exploits with Duke's 1938 Iron Dukes, that remarkable squad that had gone undefeated and unscored upon during regular season play, a team that seemed invincible. The mental fortitude and refusal to accept defeat that had served him on the gridiron had translated remarkably well to the cockpit since he'd exchanged his cleats for flight boots and taken command of a bomber crew. The Boeing B-17F 5BO, bearing serial number 41-24406, had been Bragg's assigned aircraft since late August of the previous year. He'd internalized every characteristic, every mechanical idiosyncrasy, every sound she produced during normal operations. Constructed at Boeing's Seattle manufacturing complex, she'd crossed the Atlantic as part of Operation Bolero, the massive aerial reinforcement program that had brought American air power to the European and North African theaters. Ground personnel had applied her name in prominent lettering along the forward fuselage, All American 3, the third aircraft to carry that optimistic designation, her predecessors having been lost to the various hazards endemic to aerial warfare. Technical Sergeant Joe C. James, who would also operate the powered top turret once they reached areas where enemy fighters might appear, reported from his station at the flight engineers panel that all systems showed nominal readings. James possessed the kind of intuitive mechanical sense that separated merely competent engineers from exceptional ones. When James certified an aircraft as mission-ready, crews flew with confidence. The men assembling for the mission that morning represented the peculiar egalitarianism of America's wartime military structure. Individuals from vastly divergent social and economic backgrounds, unified by rigorous training and shared purpose. Second Lieutenant Godfrey Engel Jr., serving as co-pilot, came from Connecticut's banking establishment. Navigator Harry C. Newsel had abandoned his engineering coursework at the University of Minnesota to enlist in the Army Air Forces. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge, despite being only 23, had earned his wings before Pearl Harbor, making him among the most combat-experienced members aboard. The enlisted personnel brought their own specialized expertise to the crew. Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway had mastered the notoriously temperamental liaison radio equipment that maintained communication between aircraft in formation and with ground stations. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Michael Zuck and Sergeant Elton Conda, the latter a last-minute replacement from the 341st Squadron, substituting for an irregular crew member, performed meticulous inspections of their .50 caliber Browning machine guns. In the tail position, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpoulos, who would soon acquire the nickname Lonesome Sam for reasons that would become terrifyingly apparent, settled into his isolated station with the stoic acceptance of a man who understood that he occupied the bomber's most exposed and vulnerable defensive position. The 97th Bombardment Group held the distinction of being the initial American heavy bomber unit to engage in combat operations over Europe, conducting their maiden mission from English bases on August 17th of the previous year. Subsequently, they'd relocated to North African airfields as part of Operation Torch, providing aerial support for ground campaigns aimed at expelling Axis military forces from the African continent. The group had already suffered significant losses, aircraft and crews consumed by enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and the harsh mathematics of strategic bombing warfare. The designated target for this mission represented a critical vulnerability in German supply logistics, the port infrastructure at Tunis and Bizerte. Every ton of materiel and reinforcements reaching these harbors prolonged Axis resistance in North Africa. Each successful bombing strike brought Allied forces incrementally closer to clearing the continent entirely and establishing conditions for eventual operations against southern Europe. The bomber formation coalesced over the Mediterranean with practiced efficiency, an aerial choreography refined through repeated missions. 12 B-17s, from the 414th Bombardment Squadron, assembled into their defensive box configuration, a three-dimensional arrangement engineered to maximize overlapping fields of fire from their collective .50 caliber armament. All American 3 assumed her assigned position on the right wing of the lead aircraft, Flaming Mamie, commanded by Major Robert Coulter, the squadron's operations officer. The absence of fighter escort cast a shadow over the formation. The P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighters that should have been weaving protective patterns around the bombers remained grounded with mechanical difficulties. The B-17s would need to depend entirely on their own defensive armament and the theory of mutual protection, a doctrine that remained largely theoretical against determined enemy fighter opposition. At 20,000 feet altitude, ambient temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Ice crystallized on window surfaces and froze crew members' exhaled breath inside oxygen masks, requiring constant physical removal of ice accumulations that threatened to obstruct airflow and cause suffocation. The electrically heated flight suits, representing American technological innovation, waged a losing battle against Arctic conditions at high altitude. Men routinely returned from missions suffering frostbite injuries comparable to their combat wounds. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge announced target acquisition over the intercom as Tunis materialized through scattered cloud formations below. The port bustled with activity, ships offloading supplies at piers, railway trains waiting on sidings, truck convoys streaming toward front lines where Rommel's Africa Corps was making its final stand against Montgomery's advancing 8th Army and Patton's recently arrived American forces. The bombing approach demanded absolute precision. For 3 minutes, the aircraft had to maintain straight and level flight without evasive maneuvers, while Burbridge synchronized his Norden bomb sight with the target below. This secret device, which American forces guarded so carefully that it was physically removed from aircraft after every mission, employed a sophisticated system of gyroscopes and mechanical computers to calculate the precise release point for ordnance. Someone unnecessarily reported anti-aircraft fire rising toward them. Everyone could observe the black explosive bursts blossoming around the formation, each representing hundreds of shrapnel fragments seeking aluminum and human flesh. The German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, originally designed for anti-tank applications, had proven devastatingly effective against bombers. Each shell was fused to detonate at predetermined altitude, creating lethal boxes of airspace that bomber formations had to penetrate. Burbridge announced bomb release, and all American 3 surged upward as 4,000 pounds of high explosives dropped from her bomb bay. Below, the port erupted in smoke and flame, and direct impacts on warehouse structures, secondary explosions from stored ammunition, ships listing at their moorings, suggested a highly successful strike, perhaps their most effective yet. Celebration proved premature. As the formation executed its turn westward toward home, the fighters materialized. Multiple gunners simultaneously called out warnings of enemy aircraft at 2 o'clock high, identifying them as Bf-109s. 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 G4 fighters dove from their advantageous position in the sun's glare. German pilots had learned through bitter experience that B-17 defensive fire was weakest from frontal approaches. The nose-mounted guns couldn't depress sufficiently to engage fighters attacking from low frontal angles, and the dorsal turret couldn't traverse quickly enough to track high-speed head-on attacks. The lead fighter, piloted by Oberleutnant Julius Meinberg of the 2nd JG2, temporarily detached to Jagdgeschwader 53 Pikaz, Ace of Spades, opened fire at 500 yards range. His 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns sparkled along his wings as he directed rounds into Flaming Mamie. The formation leader shuddered under the impacts, aluminum fragments peeling away like metallic confetti. The second fighter, flown by Feldwebel Erich Patzia of 6/JG-53, committed to an attack run on All-American 3. Patzia was far from inexperienced. With 16 confirmed aerial victories, he'd earned the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet presented to successful fighter pilots. He knew precisely where to aim, the cockpit to kill pilots, engines to cripple propulsion, wing routes where fuel tanks resided. Something went catastrophically wrong. At 300 yards, Patzia initiated his escape maneuver, a half-roll that should have taken him beneath the bomber and clear of defensive fire. He'd executed this maneuver dozens of times in previous engagements. This time, whether from overconfidence, target fixation, or mechanical failure, he began the maneuver too late. Or perhaps, and the historical documentation suggests this as more likely, he never began it at all, because he was already incapacitated or dead. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge would later provide detailed recollection of the crucial seconds. He had acquired the attacking fighter in his gun sight. The German aircraft was approaching directly at them, close enough that he could distinguish the pilot's face through the windscreen. Then the top turret opened fire. James had him in his sights as well. The fighter jerked violently, as though yanked by an invisible cable, and commenced a lazy, uncontrolled roll to the right. Technical Sergeant Joe James, operating the twin .50 caliber weapons in the dorsal turret, had placed a burst directly into the Bf-109's cockpit. At least one round, possibly several, had found Feldwebel Patzia. Whether death was instantaneous or he was merely incapacitated became irrelevant. 2,000 pounds of fighter aircraft, traveling in excess of 350 miles per hour, suddenly had no conscious control. What occurred next transpired in less than 2 seconds, but would be analyzed and debated for decades afterward. The Bf-109, in its uncontrolled roll, sliced into All-American 3 immediately aft of the waist gun positions. The German fighter's left wing cut through the bomber's fuselage like a blade through paper, creating a diagonal gash extending from the base of the vertical stabilizer across to the left horizontal stabilizer, which was completely severed and torn away. Navigator Harry Newsell's contemporary written account, composed in a letter to his brother within days of the incident, provides the most visceral first-hand description available. The fighter struck them with a swoosh and a bang that shook the entire airframe. Looking aft through the companionway, he couldn't process what his eyes reported. Daylight streamed through where solid airplane structure should have been. The physics of the collision defied rational comprehension. The Bf-10's wing, traveling at a relative velocity approaching 400 miles per hour, should have completely severed the B-17. Instead, through mere chance, or what numerous crew members would subsequently attribute to divine intervention, the fighter's wing missed the main structural spars on the fuselage's right side by mere inches. The tail section, containing Staff Sergeant Sarpalus, remained attached by what investigators would subsequently describe as the absolute minimum structural connection theoretically necessary to maintain any control authority whatsoever. The German fighter disintegrated. Its wing, torn off by the impact forces, remained partially embedded in the B-17's fuselage. The engine and forward fuselage sections tumbled away, enveloped in flame. The tail section, with its distinctive yellow nose and black crosses, spun like a maple seed toward the desert 5 miles below. Inside that burning wreckage rode Feldwebel Erich Patzia, born May 7, 1918 in Germany, who would be posthumously awarded his Ehrenpokal on March 1, 1943, never knowing his death had created one of aviation history's most remarkable survival narratives. The crew of All-American 3 had no opportunity to contemplate their attacker's fate. They confronted problems of their own, problems that by all established laws of physics and aerodynamics should have been insurmountable and fatal. Bragg's voice came over the intercom, steady and betraying none of the physical strain of wrestling controls that had suddenly gone mushy and unresponsive. requesting all crew members to check in and report status. The control cables running to the tail surfaces, the elevator and rudder that allowed pilots to control aircraft pitch and directional heading, had been severed or catastrophically damaged. The aircraft wanted to nose downward, to enter what aviators called a graveyard spiral. Individual crew members checked in one by one. Miraculously, no one had sustained injuries in the collision itself. But when the tail gunner's turn came, the intercom remained silent. Bragg called for Sarpalus repeatedly. "Sam, report your status." Still nothing. The interphone line to the tail position had been cut along with everything else. Through the jagged opening in the fuselage, however, the waist gunners could observe movement in the tail section. Sam Sarpalus was alive, trapped in a tail assembly that was moving independently from the main aircraft structure, swaying with each atmospheric current like, as one crew member would later describe it, a kite on a string during a hurricane. The complete extent of the damage proved staggering upon assessment. The left horizontal stabilizer was entirely gone, sheared away by the B-17's wing. The elevator on that side had vanished with it. The vertical stabilizer, the large upright tail surface, bore a massive gash through its base. The fuselage itself gaped open like a tin can from the tail gunner's position forward to just behind the waist gun windows. Control cables dangled loose in the slipstream. Hydraulic fluid leaked from severed lines, streaming behind them. Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth, navigator aboard the nearby B-17 flying flit gun, managed to maneuver his aircraft close enough to capture a photograph that would become among the war's most famous images. The image clearly shows All-American 3's tail section, offset from normal alignment, canted at an angle, suggesting imminent structural failure. The diagonal slash through the fuselage is readily visible, along with the missing stabilizer. That the aircraft was maintaining level flight appeared to violate fundamental physical laws. Someone breathed an expletive over the intercom. The entire rear end was about to separate completely. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. worked frantically alongside Bragg, attempting to discover some combination of control inputs that would maintain them airborne. With traditional control surfaces compromised, innovation became necessary. The autopilot system, electrically connected to the Norden bomb site and using electrical servos rather than mechanical cables, could potentially provide some stability if engaged partially. Differential engine power, running the left side engines at higher settings than the right, might help counteract the tendency to yaw. Every input required gentleness and measured application. Too much force on any control surface might simply tear the tail section away entirely. Major Coulter's voice crackled over the radio from Flaming Mamie, which had also sustained serious damage in the fighter attack, asking if All-American could make the return journey. Bragg surveyed the fuel gauges. No major fuel leaks were evident. Tanks still indicated adequate reserves. All 4 engines continued running, temperatures and pressures showing normal parameters. Electrical systems remained functional. The only problem with the aircraft was that significant portions of its structure were missing. A relatively minor detail, really. Bragg transmitted that they intended to attempt the return flight. In the nearly severed tail section, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpalus confronted a decision that would have paralyzed most men with indecision. He could remain where he was, hoping the tail would hold together until landing, or he could attempt to crawl forward through the damaged fuselage to the relative safety of the main aircraft body. The tail section was moving independently, sometimes displaced feet out of alignment with the rest of the aircraft. Each movement stressed the few remaining structural connections. Any sudden maneuver, any strong turbulence, and he would ride 5 tons of aluminum to certain death. Sarpalus made his decision. Gathering his chest parachute, his equipment, and in a detail that would become legendary, a borrowed jacket belonging to Lieutenant Bragg, he commenced the most dangerous 30 feet he would ever travel. The scene inside the damaged fuselage resembled apocalyptic devastation. Daylight streamed through tears in aluminum skin. Wind howled through gaps, creating a maelstrom of loose equipment, spent shell casings, and debris from the German fighter. The fuselage floor, never engineered to support weight without surrounding structure, flexed dangerously under his hands and knees. One wrong movement, one failure of overstressed aluminum, and he would fall through into 5 miles of empty air. Waist gunner Michael Zuck observed Sarpalus's approach with combined admiration and disbelief. He would later recall that Sam crawled through that chaos as though taking a leisurely stroll, calm and composed, dragging his gear behind him. When he finally reached them, the first thing he did was hand the lieutenant's jacket to Zuck with instructions to ensure the skipper received it back, noting he might need it upon landing. The journey that should have required seconds had consumed nearly 10 minutes, but Sam Sarpalus had succeeded. All 10 crew members now occupied the forward section of the aircraft, positioning them to bail out if that became necessary. The bomber formation faced a terrible calculation. Standard operational procedures dictated that damaged aircraft unable to maintain formation pace should be abandoned. They endangered the entire formation by forcing reduced speed and increased vulnerability to fighter attack. But the crews of the 414th Squadron weren't prepared to abandon All-American 3. The formation closed ranks around the wounded bomber, creating a defensive shield with their massed firepower. This meant accepting greater personal risk, flying slower, maintaining formation longer, remaining in enemy airspace precious minutes beyond necessity. These were men who had trained together, endured together the harsh conditions of North African bases, and mourned together when friends failed to return. The mathematics of survival took secondary importance to loyalty. The formation commander radioed that they would stay with All-American until clear of fighter range, instructing them to maintain steady flight. The German fighters, observing the tight defensive formation and perhaps low on fuel and ammunition, eventually turned away. They had claimed their victories, or believed they had. Julius Meinberg, Erich Pazier's wingman, would survive the engagement despite suffering severe burns when defensive fire ignited his oxygen system. In his post-war memoir titled Feindberührung, Contact with the Enemy, he would claim a B-17 kill from this engagement. He was partially correct. Flaming Mamie would indeed go down, Major Coulter and 6 crew members killed. But All-American 3 refused to die. As the formation finally crossed into Allied-controlled airspace, the other bombers began peeling away, waggling their wings in salute as they headed for Biskra. All-American 3, flying at reduced speed to minimize stress on damaged structure, would make the journey alone. The flight from target area to Biskra airfield should have required an hour. For All-American 3, fighting to remain airborne, it would consume 90 minutes that felt like 90 years. Every air pocket, every bit of turbulence, transmitted shudders through the aircraft that made crew members hold their breath. The tail section continued its independent movement, sometimes aligned with the fuselage, sometimes canted at angles that defied belief. Bragg and Engel developed a rhythm, a delicate dance with the dying aircraft. Gentle pressure on the control yoke, never sudden movements. Adjust throttles incrementally, sense the aircraft's response, adjust again. They flew more by instinct than instruments, feeling through their hands and feet what the aircraft could tolerate. Flight engineer Joe James monitored engines obsessively. Number 3 ran slightly hot, possibly from debris damage, but remained within acceptable parameters. Oil pressure held steady on all 4. Fuel consumption actually improved due to their reduced speed. The Wright Cyclone radials, constructed in factories across America by workers who would never know how their precision saved lives, continued their steady thunder. Bragg asked the navigator for distance to base. Harry Newsell had been continuously calculating and recalculating their position. The damage had affected aircraft trim, causing slightly sideways flight that pilots called crab. This affected both speed and fuel consumption, but his calculations showed they would arrive, albeit with minimal reserves. 40 minutes remaining, he reported. Weather remained clear at base. Radio operator Paul Galloway had maintained constant contact with Biskra Tower, updating them on aircraft condition. The base had mobilized every available emergency vehicle. Ambulances, fire trucks, and crash crews lined the runway. The base commander himself had come to the tower to monitor the situation. The crew executed their landing preparation with mechanical precision, each man checking and rechecking equipment. They retained their parachutes. If the tail separated during landing, they might have only seconds to evacuate. Waist gunners Zuck and Conda secured loose equipment that could become projectiles in a crash. Bombardier Burbridge secured the bomb site. Navigator Nuessel gathered his charts and equipment, each man prepared for whatever came next. For all American III's crew, their survival was already causing ripples through the German fighter community in North Africa. Pilots who had witnessed the collision were filing their reports, and intelligence officers struggled to explain what they'd observed. The Luftwaffe possessed extensive experience with B-17 flying fortresses. They'd been engaging them since Americans entered the European Air War. They understood the bomber's capabilities and limitations. German technical analysis had determined that a B-17 required approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells to ensure destruction. The aircraft's multiple redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction made them frustratingly difficult to bring down. But this situation, a B-17 flying with half its tail missing, exceeded their calculations. Initial reports met with skepticism. Surely the pilots had been mistaken. Perhaps the bomber had crashed later, beyond observation. No aircraft could survive such damage, yet evidence proved incontrovertible. Multiple pilots had witnessed All-American III flying in formation after the collision. Ground observers had tracked it on radar, maintaining altitude and heading long after it should have fallen from the sky. The incident would be added to a growing file of reports, forcing the Luftwaffe to reconsider tactical approaches to attacking American heavy bombers. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces and key figure in Luftwaffe fighter tactics, would later write about the psychological impact of American bomber durability. Witnessing a flying fortress continue flying with injuries that would have destroyed any other aircraft proved deeply demoralizing to young pilots. They would expend ammunition, score what should have been killing hits, and watch the Americans fly home. Bragg transmitted to Biskra Tower that they were 5 minutes out, requesting straight-in approach to runway 27. Tower cleared them for immediate approach, emergency vehicles standing by, and inquired about wounded aboard. Bragg and Engel exchanged glances. By all rights, they should all be dead. Yet here they were, 10 men without a scratch among them, at least not from the collision. Bragg reported no wounded, just structural damage requiring a straight approach. Through the windscreen, the brown expanse of Biskra airfield materialized from desert haze. Home, safety, solid ground. The most beautiful sight any of them had ever witnessed. Engel announced gear deployment, moving the lever. The landing gear operated on a separate hydraulic system from control surfaces, and to everyone's relief, they heard and felt the reassuring thunk of wheels locking into position. 3 green indicator lights illuminated on the panel. The gear was down and locked. Engel queried about flaps. Bragg considered the options. Flaps would reduce landing speed, but would also alter airflow over the tail, potentially adding stress to damaged structure. He decided against flaps. They'd come in fast and use the entire runway length. The approach demanded every ounce of skill Bragg had developed through hundreds of flight training hours. The aircraft didn't want to fly straight. It wanted to yaw, to roll, to pitch downward. Every correction required an opposite correction, a constant battle against aerodynamic forces that should have prevailed 80 miles ago. 1 mile out, then half a mile. The runway rushed up to meet them, wider and more welcome than any runway had ever been. Ground crews lined taxiways, watching in stunned silence as the impossible aircraft made its final approach. Some would later claim they could see daylight through the fuselage from a quarter-mile distance. The main wheels contacted the sand-swept runway at 110 miles per hour, faster than normal, but as gently as Bragg could manage. The aircraft settled, and for a moment landing appeared textbook perfect. Then physics reasserted itself. Without the tailwheel, destroyed in the collision, the tail section dropped to the runway surface. The aircraft became a 65,000-pound sled, grinding down the runway in a shower of sparks and aluminum fragments. The sound proved indescribable, metal on concrete, a shriek audible for miles. Bragg and Engels stood on the brakes, fighting to maintain directional control as they decelerated. Without the tail wheel and with compromised rudder control, any deviation from straight ahead could cause a ground loop, a violent rotation that would certainly tear the aircraft apart. 100 yards, 200, 300. The aircraft finally ground to a halt, sitting at an awkward angle with its tail on the runway and nose pointed skyward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, as if responding to a signal, all 10 crew members scrambled for exits. They assembled on the runway, looking back at their aircraft in disbelief. The damage exceeded even their imagined worst case. The tail section hung at an impossible angle, connected to the fuselage by what appeared to be strips of aluminum no thicker than heavy paper. How it had held together for 90 minutes of flight transcended comprehension. Bragg informed the flight surgeon, rushing up with his medical team, that they were all fine, not a scratch. The doctor looked from crew to aircraft and back, his expression suggesting he was witnessing either miracle or mass hallucination. What occurred next would become part of legend, told and retold in ready rooms across the theater. 3 ground crew members from another squadron, curious about the damage, climbed aboard All-American 3 for a closer look. They made their way aft, peering through the gash in the fuselage, marveling at the destruction. Their combined weight, perhaps 500 pounds, proved the final straw. With a grinding, tearing sound of overstressed metal finally yielding, the tail section separated completely from the fuselage and collapsed onto the runway. The 3 airmen scrambled clear, white-faced and shaking, suddenly understanding just how close to death the aircrew had been aloft. Master Sergeant Hyland from the 50th Air Service Squadron walked slowly around the wreckage, taking notes on a clipboard. His job involved determining if the aircraft could be repaired or should be written off as total loss. The question should have been academic. No aircraft this badly damaged could ever fly again. But this was 1943, and America was producing B-17 at a rate that seemed impossible to everyone except the Americans themselves. In Seattle, Burbank and Long Beach, workers were completing new flying fortresses every few hours. Production lines ran 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly, staffed by men too old or too young for military service and by women who had never seen factory interiors before Pearl Harbor. Hyland examined the serial number painted on the tail, 41-24406. This aircraft had already survived more than any machine should be asked to endure. Perhaps she had one more miracle remaining. Conventional wisdom insisted All-American 3 was finished. Damage was too extensive, structural integrity too compromised. In any other air force, she would have been cannibalized for spare parts with the remainder scrapped. But the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 operated on different philosophy. If it could be fixed, it would be fixed. Master Sergeant Hyland and the men of the 50th Air Service Squadron spent 6 weeks performing what could only be described as major surgery. They located a tail section from another B-17 damaged beyond repair in a landing accident. Using techniques more appropriate to shipyards than aircraft maintenance facilities, they grafted the new tail section onto All-American 3's fuselage. Every control cable required replacement. Every electrical connection required testing and retesting. The men worked in desert heat, reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then through desert nights when temperatures plummeted toward freezing. They worked because every repaired aircraft meant another crew flying another mission. On March 18, 1943, all American 3 flew again. Not on a combat mission initially, but on a test flight that had ground crews holding their breath. She flew perfectly. The repairs held. Within days, she returned to combat operations, though assigned to less demanding roles. Transport flights, training missions, operations to areas where fighter opposition was unlikely. She had earned the right to easier assignments. On March 6, 1945, at Lucera Airfield in Italy, she was finally retired and salvaged, her war concluded at last. Research into the German pilot who collided with All-American 3 reveals a young man whose story intersected with history in the most violent manner possible. Feldwebel Erich Pazia was 24 years old on February 1, 1943, just 1 year younger than Kendrick Bragg. Born May 7, 1918, he had grown up in a Germany transformed by National Socialism, trained in glider clubs, secretly preparing pilots for the Luftwaffe that wasn't supposed to exist under Versailles Treaty restrictions. By early 1943, Pazia had proven himself an exceptional fighter pilot. His 16 confirmed victories placed him among successful but not legendary aces of the Luftwaffe. Men who performed their duties with skill and professionalism, but whose names wouldn't be celebrated in propaganda broadcasts. He flew with 6/Jagdgeschwader 53 Pik Ass, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful fighter wings, credited with over 4,000 Allied aircraft destroyed during the war. The Bf-109G4 he flew that day represented the latest evolution of Willy Messerschmitt's revolutionary fighter design. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, producing 1,475 horsepower, armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns in the nose, it was formidable opposition for any Allied aircraft. In experienced pilot hands like Pazia's, it should have been more than a match for a lumbering B-17. But aerial combat's calculus is unforgiving. One moment of inattention, one bullet in the wrong place, and experience becomes irrelevant. The burst from Technical Sergeant Joe James's twin .50 calibers found its mark, and Erich Pazia's war ended instantly. His body was recovered from the fighter wreckage and buried at Borj Sedria German War Cemetery in Benares, Tunisia, where it remains. Plot 3, Row 8, Grave 15. On March 1, 1943, Pazia was posthumously awarded the Ehrenpokal der Luftwaffe, the honor goblet recognizing his achievements as fighter pilot. The citation made no mention of the collision, only noting he had died in aerial combat against enemy bombers. His family would receive the traditional letter from his commanding officer expressing regret and praising his service to the Reich. They would never know their son's death had created one of aviation history's most remarkable survival stories. All-American 3's survival became a case study for Boeing engineers and Army Air Force's technical analysts. How had an aircraft missing critical structural components managed 90 minutes of flight? The answer lay in the revolutionary design philosophy that had created the B-17. Unlike previous bombers relying on a single main spar running through wing and fuselage, the B-17 employed semi-monocoque construction. Strength came not from a single component, but from the entire structure working together. The aluminum skin itself carried loads, reinforced by frames and stringers that distributed stress throughout the airframe. When primary load paths failed, secondary and even tertiary paths could, under the right circumstances, carry enough load to maintain structural integrity. The key to All-American 3's survival was what hadn't been damaged. The wing-to-fuselage junction, the strongest point on the aircraft, remained intact. The main wing spars, carrying the weight of 4 engines and fuel tanks, were undamaged. The bomb bay area, with its robust construction necessary to carry 8,000 pounds of ordnance, provided a rigid box holding forward and aft sections together even when connecting structure was compromised. Boeing engineer William Allen, reviewing incident reports, noted that the B-17 had been designed with combat damage in mind from the beginning. They knew these aircraft would take hits. They built in redundancy wherever possible: multiple control cables, backup hydraulic systems, structural members that could carry loads even when their neighbors failed. The fact that this aircraft survived such extreme damage validated every extra pound of structure they included. The electrical system played a crucial role in aircraft survival. While mechanical control cables were severed or damaged, electrical wires running to autopilot servos remained partially functional. This allowed Bragg and Engel to maintain some control authority through the Norden bombsite's autopilot system, a capability that hadn't been designed for this purpose but proved invaluable in extremis. All American III's survival sent ripples through both Allied and Axis air forces. For American bomber crews, it became a morale-boosting legend told in briefing rooms from England to Italy. If all American III could make it home with half her tail shot off, surely their damaged aircraft could make it too. The psychological impact was immeasurable. Crews flew with greater confidence, knowing their flying fortresses could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident: a puppy praying atop an aircraft tail section, a reference to the phrase "coming in on a wing and a prayer." Though the famous song of that title was actually written about another aircraft, Thunderbird, the association with All-American III became permanent in squadron lore. For the Germans, the incident reinforced growing concerns about American industrial capability. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe aircraft production, had already warned about strategic implications of American bomber production. "The Americans are building bombers like we build cars," he told a conference of fighter commanders. "No, faster than we build cars. And these bombers are not fragile. They are flying tanks." The tactical implications were significant. Luftwaffe doctrine had assumed catastrophic structural damage would destroy any bomber. Pilots were trained to aim for critical points: wing routes, cockpits, bomb bays, where a few well-placed cannon shells should prove fatal. But incidents like All-American III proved that even perfect shots might not bring down a B-17. Major Günther Rall, who would become the third highest scoring ace in history with 275 victories, wrote about the frustration of attacking B-17s. "You would attack, score hits, see pieces flying off, and watch the bomber continue flying. You would attack again, expend all ammunition, and still it flew. Sometimes you wondered if American bombers were protected by supernatural forces." The Germans began developing new tactics, attacking from the front where defensive armament was weakest, concentrating multiple fighters on single bombers, developing heavier weapons specifically for bomber destruction. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon, firing explosive shells that could blow meter-wide holes in bomber structures, was a direct response to B-17 durability. The 10 men who survived the impossible flight of All-American III would carry the experience for the rest of their lives, each processing it in their own way. Their story, verified by contemporary documents and eyewitness accounts, stands as one of World War II aviation history's most thoroughly documented incidents. First, Lieutenant Kendrick Robertson Bragg, Jr. would complete his tour of duty and return to the United States, where he served as instructor pilot, teaching new bomber crews skills that might one day save their lives. He rarely spoke about February 1st, 1943, even to family. When pressed, he would simply state, "They were lucky. Good airplane, good crew, lucky." He died October 13th, 1999. Navigator Harry Newsell would spend decades responding to inquiries about the incident. When he looked back and saw daylight through the airplane, he thought they were finished. But Bragg and Engel kept her flying. He didn't know how, but they did. Newsell would pass away June 27th, 1991, at age 74. Bombardier Ralph Burbridge became the crew's unofficial historian, spending decades correcting myths that accumulated around their story. In interviews conducted near the end of his life, he systematically debunked embellishments. No, they hadn't used parachute cords to hold the plane together. No, they hadn't completed their bomb run after the collision. It happened on the way home. No, they weren't headed for England, but back to their base in Algeria. Burbridge understood the true story was remarkable enough without exaggeration. He died February 3rd, 2013, at age 92, one of the last surviving witnesses to that day over Tunisia. Co-pilot Godfrey Engel Jr. returned to Connecticut after the war. Rarely speaking of his military service, those who knew him said he would sometimes unconsciously move his hands as if working aircraft controls, especially during thunderstorms. He lived until May 3rd, 2007, dying at age 86. Flight engineer and top turret gunner Technical Sergeant Joe James carried the knowledge that he had saved his crew by shooting down an attacking fighter, but that action had led to a collision that nearly killed them all. The paradox haunted him. He did his job, he would say when asked. That's all any of them did, their job. The waist gunners, Michael Zuck and Elton Conda, maintained that watching Sam Sarpalus crawl through the destroyed fuselage was the bravest thing they witnessed in the war. They saw a lot of brave men do brave things, Zuck said in a 1985 interview. But Sam crawling through that mess, calm as could be, that was something special. Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpalus himself, Lonesome Sam, who had ridden the severed tail section, became something of a legend in the Army Air Forces. His matter-of-fact courage, exemplified by his concern for returning Bragg's jacket, represented the kind of unflappable determination that characterized the best American aircrew. What else was he going to do, he said, when asked about his crawl through the damaged fuselage? Sit there and wait to fall out of the sky? Better to die trying than die waiting. Radio operator Paul Galloway would note that maintaining communication with the base during the return flight was one of the hardest things he ever did. Every time the plane lurched, he thought they were coming apart, but he kept transmitting their position, keeping his voice steady. If they went down, he wanted them to know where to find them. The photograph taken by Lieutenant Charles Cliff Cutforth from Flying Flit Gun became one of World War II's most analyzed images. Catalogued as U.S. Air Force Photo 050524-F-1234-P-015, it shows All-American 3 in profile against the North African desert, damage to her tail section clearly visible. The image would be studied by engineers, pilots, and historians for decades, each searching for clues explaining the impossible. What the photograph reveals is both devastating damage and improbable survival. The left horizontal stabilizer is completely gone. The vertical stabilizer shows a massive diagonal gash. The fuselage is opened from the tail gunner's position forward. Yet the aircraft maintains level flight, all 4 engines running, seemingly defying every principle of aerodynamics. Over the decades, numerous versions of the photograph have circulated, many with inaccurate captions. Some claim to show the aircraft over the English Channel, escorted by P-51 Mustangs. Others have been published with captions claiming it was taken from a German fighter. Some versions have been doctored to make damage appear even more dramatic than it was. But the original, authentic photograph needs no embellishment. It captures a moment that shouldn't exist, an aircraft flying despite damage, exceeding all design tolerances, all safety margins, all reasonable expectations. It is visual proof of what 10 men achieved through skill, determination, and what many would call divine intervention. The incident of February 1st, 1943, occurred at a crucial juncture in the North African campaign. The Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible under Erwin Rommel, was being squeezed between Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east and American forces pushing from the west. The port facilities at Tunis and Bizerte, targets of that day's mission, were vital lifelines for Axis forces. Every successful bombing mission hastened inevitable German surrender in North Africa. Within 3 months of All-American III's miraculous return, Axis forces in North Africa would capitulate. On May 13, 1943, nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, a defeat comparable to Stalingrad in its impact on German military capability. The bombers of the 97th Bombardment Group, including the repaired All-American III, had played their part in this victory. The B-17 Flying Fortress would become the most iconic American bomber of World War II. Though the B-24 Liberator was produced in greater numbers and could carry heavier bomb loads farther, it was the B-17 that captured public imagination. Its ability to absorb punishment and bring crews home became legendary. By war's end, B-17s had dropped 640,036 tons of bombs on European targets, more than any other American aircraft. But the cost was staggering. Of the 12,731 B-17s produced, 4,735 were lost in combat. Each loss represented 10 young men who wouldn't come home. The survival rate for bomber crews was among the lowest in the military. Completion of a 25-mission tour, later raised to 35, was considered beating the odds. The miracle of All-American III stood in stark contrast to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. Aviation engineers studying the All-American III incident have provided valuable insights into how the aircraft managed to survive. Analysis suggests the aircraft was operating at the absolute margins of controllability. The center of gravity had shifted dramatically aft due to lost structure, putting the aircraft into a condition that would challenge even modern flight control systems. Key factors in survival were structural redundancy. The B-17's design included multiple load paths for critical forces. When primary structures failed, secondary systems managed to hold just enough to maintain basic integrity. Speed reduction. By immediately reducing airspeed, Bragg minimized aerodynamic forces trying to tear the aircraft apart. Every mile per hour of speed reduction decreased stress on damaged structure exponentially. Gentle control inputs. Analysis shows any aggressive control input would have exceeded remaining structure's capability. Bragg and Engel's gentle, coordinated control movements kept forces within survivable limits. Weight distribution, crew movement forward from the tail section, actually helped by shifting the center of gravity, partially compensating for lost tail weight. And environmental factors. Relatively smooth air over North African desert meant no severe turbulence to stress-damaged structure. Had they encountered a thunderstorm or severe turbulence, the aircraft would not have survived. The engineering community continues studying this incident as an example of how robust design and skilled piloting can combine to achieve seemingly impossible outcomes. Lessons learned from All-American III influenced post-war aircraft design, particularly in areas of structural redundancy and battle damage tolerance. Research into Luftwaffe archives provides the German perspective on the incident. The loss of Erich Patzier was recorded in the war diary of JG-53 with typical German precision. Feldwebel-Passia failed to return from combat mission against American bomber formation, witnessed colliding with enemy aircraft by Oberleutnant Meinberg, aircraft and pilot lost. What official records don't capture is the impact such incidents had on German fighter morale. Young pilots, many with less than 100 hours of flight time by 1943, were told American bombers were easy targets, slow and vulnerable. Then they would attack these easy targets and watch them absorb incredible damage and keep flying. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, who developed the head-on attack tactic that would become standard Luftwaffe doctrine against bomber formations, wrote that American bombers were not what they expected. They expected them to be like German bombers, fragile, requiring fighter escort, vulnerable to determined attack. Instead, they found flying fortresses in the true sense, castles in the air that could defend themselves and survive damage that seemed impossible. The Luftwaffe began keeping detailed records of B-17 survivability, trying to determine weak points and optimal attack angles. Their studies showed that even when they achieved what should be catastrophic damage, B-17s had a disturbing tendency to make it home. This led to development of increasingly heavy armament for fighter aircraft, culminating in rocket projectiles and 30mm cannons that could destroy bombers with single hits. The engineers and workers who had designed and built aircraft 41-24406 never met the men who flew her, but they felt a connection nonetheless. Every rivet driven, every wire connected, every system tested had contributed to bringing those 10 men home. The B-17 design had begun in 1934 when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a multi-engine bomber. Boeing's Model 299, which would become the B-17, first flew July 28, 1935. From the beginning, the design philosophy emphasized survivability. Multiple engines so the aircraft could fly with one or two failed, redundant control systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around critical components and crew positions. But the incident of All-American 3 exceeded even Boeing's expectations. The company would use the incident in training materials for new engineers, demonstrating the importance of redundancy and over-engineering. "Build it stronger than it needs to be" became an unofficial motto, because someday someone's life will depend on that extra strength. The production statistics of the B-17 program remain staggering even by today's standards. At peak production, Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega were completing 16 B-17s every day. The workforce included thousands of women, Rosie the riveters, who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Yet they achieved quality standards that would be challenging today with computer-controlled machinery. Over decades, the story of All-American 3 has accumulated layers of myth and exaggeration. Various retellings have added dramatic elements that never occurred. The crew using parachute cords to hold the plane together, completing their bombing run after the collision, flying all the way to England, the tail gunner being rescued mid-flight. These embellishments, while dramatic, actually diminish the true achievement. The reality, verified by contemporary documents, crew testimony, and photographic evidence, needs no exaggeration. 10 men flew a catastrophically damaged aircraft 90 minutes and 150 miles to safety. They did it through skill, determination, and teamwork. They did it without losing a single crew member. They did it in an aircraft that had no business flying, but somehow forgot to fall from the sky. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier who spent his later years correcting the record, understood this. "The true story is amazing enough," he said in his final interview. "We don't need to make things up. What happened that day was impossible, but we did it anyway. That's the story that should be told." The 414th Bombardment Squadron would fly 178 combat missions during World War II, losing 85 aircraft and hundreds of aircrew. But no story from their combat record matched All-American 3 for sheer impossibility. The incident became part of squadron identity, a touchstone story defining what they were capable of achieving. The squadron's new emblem, inspired by the incident, showed a puppy praying atop a tail section. The choice of a puppy rather than a more martial symbol reflected the youth of aircrew, most in their early 20s, and their vulnerability facing enemy fighters and flak. Yet the praying attitude suggested both hope and the divine intervention many crew members genuinely believed had saved All-American 3. Veterans of the 414th would gather for reunions decades after the war, and inevitably someone would retell the story of February 1st, 1943. Men who had flown their own harrowing missions, who had their own stories of survival against odds, would listen with respect to the tale of the bomber that refused to die. The German fighter forces' encounter with All-American 3 was part of a learning curve that would drive significant tactical and technical evolution throughout 1943. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with fighters optimized for dogfighting. Light, maneuverable aircraft with rifle-caliber machine guns adequate for downing other fighters. The appearance of heavy bombers forced complete reconsideration. By mid-1943, partially in response to incidents like All-American 3, German fighters were being outgunned with heavier weapons. The Bf-109G6, introduced shortly after the Tunisia incident, carried a 30mm Mk108 cannon-firing explosive shells capable of blowing meter-wide holes in bomber structures. The FW-190 was modified to carry multiple 20mm cannons and even 210mm rockets specifically for bomber destruction. Major Walter Nowotny, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber interceptors with 258 victories, wrote about the evolution. Each month, the American bombers seemed to get tougher. They would develop new tactics, new weapons, and the Americans would counter with better defensive formations, better armor, longer-range escort fighters. It was a race they were slowly losing. The psychological impact on German pilots was significant. Young pilots, increasingly poorly trained as the war progressed, were told to press home attacks against bomber formations. But pressing home attacks against B-17s meant flying into converging streams of .50 caliber fire from multiple aircraft. The survival rate for German fighter pilots declined precipitously as 1943 progressed. All-American 3's survival was made possible not just by Boeing's design, but by an entire industrial ecosystem supporting the aircraft. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines were built in factories in New Jersey and Ohio. The 50 caliber machine guns came from facilities in Connecticut and Michigan. The aluminum skin was rolled in plants in Tennessee and Washington. The instruments were manufactured in dozens of specialized facilities across the country. This distributed production network meant no single bombing raid, no single sabotage operation could significantly impact B-17 production. It also meant improvements and modifications could be rapidly implemented across the production network. Lessons learned from combat damage were incorporated into new aircraft within weeks. The scale of American industrial mobilization remains difficult to comprehend. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps had 1,700 aircraft total. By 1945, American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft. The B-17 program alone employed over 40,000 workers at Boeing's Seattle plant, working 3 shifts around the clock. Beyond the technical marvel and strategic implications, the story of All-American 3 is fundamentally about 10 young men facing impossible circumstances. They were not professional soldiers, but citizens who had answered their nation's call. Bragg had been a college athlete, Newessel, an engineering student. Burbridge had joined before Pearl Harbor simply because he wanted to fly. Their calm professionalism facing catastrophic damage speaks to the quality of training the Army Air Forces had created from scratch, the largest aerial training program in history. By 1943, training bases scattered across America were producing 100,000 new pilots annually, along with similar numbers of navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and other aircrew. This training emphasized not just technical skills, but crew coordination and emergency procedures. Crews flew together through advanced training, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, developing the teamwork that would save lives in combat. The crew of All-American 3 had flown together for months, creating the mutual trust that allowed them to function effectively even when their aircraft was literally falling apart around them. While one bomber's survival might seem tactically insignificant in a war involving thousands of aircraft, the strategic impact was considerable. The incident occurred during a critical period when American daylight bombing doctrine was being severely tested. The theory that heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets without fighter escort was proving costly. But incidents like All-American 3 provided evidence that the B-17 could at least survive the journey home, even when severely damaged. This survivability meant experienced crews were more likely to complete their tours, preserving institutional knowledge and improving overall effectiveness. It meant damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service rather than being total losses. More importantly, it affected German strategic calculations. If American bombers were this difficult to destroy, and if American industry could produce them faster than Germany could shoot them down, then the mathematics of aerial attrition favored the Allies. This realization contributed to the gradual shift of German production priorities from offensive to defensive weapons, from bombers to fighters, a shift that would ultimately prove futile. Despite extensive documentation, some aspects of All-American 3's survival remain subjects of engineering study. How did the few remaining structural members, designed to carry perhaps 20% of the loads they endured, hold together for 90 minutes? Why didn't aerodynamic flutter, the destructive vibration that can tear damaged aircraft apart, develop during the return flight? The aircraft appears to have been operating in what engineers call a non-linear regime, a condition where normal aerodynamic rules become unpredictable. The fact that the aircraft remained controllable in this regime may have been due to a fortunate combination of factors: the specific damage pattern, atmospheric conditions, pilot skill, all aligning to create a survivable situation against overwhelming odds. In 1985, several surviving members of the crew gathered for a reunion in Austin, Texas. Age had silvered their hair and slowed their steps, but when they stood before a B-17 on static display, the years fell away. They walked through the aircraft, each remembering their position on that day 42 years earlier. Bragg, then 67, sat in the pilot's seat one more time, his hands automatically finding the control yoke. "She was a good ship," he said quietly. "She brought us home when she had every right to quit on us. You can't ask more than that from an airplane." Burbridge, standing in the bombardier's position in the nose, pointed through the plexiglass. That's where he saw the fighter coming in, right there, straight at them. He could still see the pilot's face sometimes, just before James got him. They signed autographs for aviation enthusiasts who had come to meet the men of All-American 3. They answered questions, posed for photographs, shared memories. But there were also long silences, moments when each man was back over Tunisia, feeling the aircraft shudder from the impact, wondering if the next second would be their last. Military historians have placed the incident of All-American 3 within the broader context of the air war over Europe and North Africa. The incident exemplifies both the robustness of American bomber design and the courage of the young men who flew them. It demonstrates that survival in aerial combat often depended on a combination of good engineering, skilled piloting, and simple luck. The incident also influenced post-war aviation design. The concept of redundancy, of building aircraft that could survive battle damage, became central to military aircraft design. Modern combat aircraft incorporate lessons learned from B-17 combat experience, including multiple hydraulic systems, redundant flight controls, and structural designs that prevent catastrophic failure from localized damage. The statistics of All-American 3's survival remain compelling. 90 minutes flight time from collision to landing, 150 miles distance flown with catastrophic damage, 20,000 feet altitude at impact, 10 crew members all survived uninjured, effectively 0 feet of structural connection holding the tail, 6 weeks to repair and return to service. One photograph that captured the impossible for history, 16 victories for Eric Patzia's combat record before the collision, serial number 41-24406, that should have been on a loss report. These numbers tell a story of survival that shouldn't have been possible yet was meticulously documented and verified. Today, only a handful of B-17s remain airworthy, maintained by dedicated organizations keeping the memory of the flying fortress alive. When these aircraft appear at air shows, elderly veterans and aviation enthusiasts gather to see them, to hear the distinctive sound of Wright Cyclone engines, to remember. The story of All-American 3 is told at these gatherings, usually by someone who knew someone who was there or who has studied the incident in detail. Young people listen with skepticism. Surely the story has been exaggerated. Then they see the photograph, read the crew testimonies, examine the technical reports. The skepticism turns to amazement. The aircraft herself is long gone, scrapped in 1945 after giving everything she had to give. But her story endures in museums, in books, in the memories of an ever-dwindling number of World War II veterans. She has become more than just an aircraft. She has become a symbol of American industrial capability, of aircrew courage, and of the sometimes inexplicable nature of survival in war. In his last interview before his death in 2013, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was asked what message he wanted to leave about All-American 3. He thought for a long moment before answering. "They were just doing their jobs," he said. "That's what people today need to understand. They weren't heroes. They were young men, far from home, doing a job that needed doing. The airplane was built by people doing their job, building the best bomber they could. When they got hit, everyone did their job. Kenny flew, the gunners watched for fighters. He helped navigate, Sam crawled out of the tail. The miracle wasn't that they survived. The miracle was that thousands of people, from the factory workers who built their plane to the ground crews who patched her up, all did their jobs well enough that when everything went wrong, they had a chance. That's the American way. Everyone doing their part, and sometimes when you need it most, it all comes together and works. They flew home in an airplane that couldn't fly, landed a plane that couldn't land, and walked away from what should have been their grave. If that's not a miracle, he didn't know what is. The story of All-American 3 transcends the boundaries of a simple combat narrative. It represents a moment when the impossible became possible, when engineering excellence met human determination and created an outcome that still challenges understanding of what aircraft can survive. The 10 men who flew home on February 1st, 1943, were carried not just by 4 Wright Cyclone engines and Boeing aluminum, but by the accumulated expertise of American industry, the training of the Army Air Forces, and perhaps something more. Call it luck, fate, or divine intervention. Their survival proved that the B-17 Flying Fortress had earned its name not through propaganda but through demonstrated capability. For the Germans who witnessed it, the incident was a glimpse of what they were truly fighting. Not just American aircraft, but American industrial might, American training systems, and American determination. For a Luftwaffe already struggling with the mathematics of attrition, all American 3 was proof the numbers would never add up in their favor. The photograph taken that day, a B-17 flying with its tail nearly severed, has become one of World War II's iconic images. But it represents more than just one miraculous survival. It captures the essence of the American air campaign, damaged but still flying, wounded but still fighting, against all odds but still coming home. Kendrick Bragg and his crew didn't set out to make history on February 1st, 1943. They set out to bomb a target and return to base, just another mission in a war that seemed endless. But when disaster struck, when a dying German fighter sliced their aircraft nearly in half, they responded with the kind of quiet professionalism that characterized the best of the greatest generation. They didn't panic. They didn't give up. They simply did what needed to be done, each man at his position, each doing his job, trusting in their aircraft, their training, and each other. In doing so, they created a story that would outlive them all, a testament to what becomes possible when engineering excellence meets human courage. The Germans were shocked when two aircraft became one, when fighter and bomber merged in a violent embrace that should have destroyed both. They were even more shocked when the American bomber, against every law of physics and probability, flew home. It was a preview of American industrial and military capability that would eventually overwhelm the Third Reich. All American 3 flew home on February 1st, 1943, carrying 10 men who should have died but didn't, in an aircraft that couldn't fly but did. She carried more than her crew. She carried proof that American bombers were tougher than anyone imagined, that American aircrews were equal to any challenge, and that sometimes, in war's darkest moments, the impossible becomes possible. The tail section that finally fell off after landing, that couldn't support the weight of 3 curious ground crew members, had somehow supported itself in flight for 90 minutes. It remains one of aviation's enduring mysteries, a reminder that human courage and determination can sometimes overcome even the laws of physics. Today, when engineers study the incident, when historians document it, when veterans remember it, they all reach the same conclusion. This shouldn't have been possible, yet the evidence is incontrovertible. The photographs, the testimonies, the official records all confirm that all American 3 flew home when she should have fallen from the sky. In that impossibility lies the true meaning of the story. It reminds us that in the extremity of human experience, when life and death hang in the balance, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. 10 young Americans in a broken airplane over hostile territory refused to accept defeat. In their refusal, in their determination to survive against impossible odds, they created a legend that will endure as long as people remember the Second World War. The Germans were shocked when a B-17 flew with half its tail missing, one dying, one damaged, but determined to survive. They witnessed American engineering at its finest, American airmanship at its best, and American determination at its most indomitable. They witnessed the impossible, and the impossible flew home.